to them. And then throughout the book, you'll see in various ways he lets them know how he's a God of mercy and compassion and grace, and he's guiding them all throughout their exodus, their journey, their spiritual walk. And so throughout the book of Exodus, God reveals himself to his people in all different ways, much as he does still today to us. And today Pharaoh asked this question, who is the Lord? And he finishes actually by saying, who is the Lord that I should heed him? Meaning, who is the Lord that I should obey him? Why? And it's actually a very intellectually honest question for anybody to ask, who is this Lord? And why should you obey him? And you get this immediately after the Pharaoh asked this question, God starts to give all these plagues, the famous plagues, right? And it's a way for God to say, listen, Pharaoh, and anybody else, if you want to know who is the Lord and why you should heed him, it's found in the plagues. Now, when we and Reg, we did skip, you'll notice, and normally we don't do that. I don't like skipping verses or chapters as much and putting verses together. I only did it today for a special reason because otherwise it's just too long. There's a lot of plagues, and we'll summarize them basically, but I wanted to save your time a little bit today. So that's why we condensed and we jumped along. We started in Exodus 5. Moses goes up to Pharaoh and he says, this is what the Lord says, let my people go. Why? So that they can worship me. And Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey him? And then we started and we looked at the first plague, which was the Nile turning into blood. And we ended in Exodus 10 with the second to the last plague. We'll get to the last one in next week. The second to last plague is this darkness over the land for 3 days. And see, Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? Now, you must know something about Pharaoh. He's not an atheist. He's not saying there is no Lord. He's not saying, Moses, oh, that's all well and good, but there is no God. There is no higher power. No. If anything, Pharaoh and the Egyptians were pluralists. They're what we call, they worshipped many things. They worshipped the Nile. There was a powerful reason why God turned that into blood. They worshiped the sun and the moon, which is part of the reason why God darkened them out. They were always worshiping something. So what Pharaoh's asking is actually a really fundamental and modern question. It's a very, very intellectually and spiritually honest question to ask. Who is the Lord among all the other lords? And why should I put him first in my life and not anything else? Pharaoh had put many other things before the Lord, and he says, essentially, why? Tell me, Moses, why? Why should I put your God above any other God that I have in my life? Whether it's my career, whether it's my status, whether it's my family or my relationships, whether it's even my independence that I may worship. Why should I put and obey this God as opposed to any other God? And God gives him a really interesting answer. He says, this is how you'll know me. You will know me through the plagues. What? I mean, if you look at this on the surface, if God says, you'll know me through the plagues, this is where people, you might have a light that goes on or a red flag in your head, and you say, look, aha, this is the brutish, vengeful, mean Old Testament God. This is the wrathful God. This is the God who rains down pestilence on people. I don't want any part of that God. I want a God who loves. I want a God who includes. I want a God who forgives everybody and loves all. If you do that today, you're missing the entire point of what the plagues represent. God looks at Pharaoh and he says, you want to know who I am? And you want to know why I should be the most important and central thing in your life? You'll see it through the plagues. And you're tempted to say, well, listen, this is God just asserting his power. He's flexing his muscles. He's trying to be the all-powerful, vengeful God again. No. No. He's doing something much more dramatic, much more unique, and much, much more powerful. Who is the Lord that I should heed him? Why should I obey him? Here's why. God says, you'll know me through the plagues. And through the plagues, there's two ways that we know him. And I worded them a little bit oddly on your outline, and I did that on purpose. Who is the Lord? He's the natural Lord. Who is the Lord? He's the saving Lord. And you must know both of these together, hand in hand. or you'll never really know who he is. And you'll never ever really want to put him in the central place of your life. You'll always ask, why should I heed him? Why obey him? And God says, because of the plagues. And as counterintuitive as that is for you and me, it is so radically beautiful and filled with grace. Let me explain what I mean. First, who is the Lord? He's the natural Lord. What does that mean? Does that mean natural Lord? That sounds just weird. Well, he's the Lord of nature, of course, and he controls nature, as you see in the plagues. And this is not going to be an environmental message. So yeah, love the environment, plant a tree, all good. But that's not what he's saying here in reality. Look at these plagues. We didn't read each one of them, so let me summarize them a little bit. And almost every commentary you'll read notices that there's a unique trend. Something's going on here. Each plague, for the most part, is a natural occurrence in earth that feeds off the plague before it. You see here, he starts with blood in the Nile. Okay, the Nile was the primary water source. It was the life-giving source for crops and everything else that the Egyptians required. So when that fills with blood, the Egyptians scramble to try to find water. They dig and dig and dig in the earth. But listen, when the water turns to blood, what happens? The frogs come out, which is the next plague. The fish all die. They can't get out of the water. But when the water turns to blood, the frogs come out, and the frogs overpopulate the city. Then, in the course of time, the frogs die. And when you got a bunch of frog carcasses laying around, what comes next? Gnats and flies, which is the two next plagues. And when you got lots of gnats and flies flying around, what happens then? The livestock, they get infected. Almost every plague is a natural deterioration of the ecosystem. And it all feeds on one another. Isn't this interesting? Let me put it in context and say it this way. God could, if he really wanted to reveal himself to Pharaoh, wouldn't he say, Moses, that mountain, go turn it on its head? Wouldn't he say, Moses, make that person catch fire and then blow up? I mean, it sounds, I know, rude. But there's many other ways. He could have shown his power. He could have shown his power in one fell swoop. And yet he builds this odd natural deterioration of the ecosystem as a way to say this. Disobedience to me means the natural deterioration of the harmony that I put into the earth. Things break down, he says, if you don't follow me. The earth breaks down. And it continues in a cycle. And some commentators actually go as far as to say that what happens in the plagues is almost a mirror opposite to what happens in the book of Genesis in creation. How did creation start? According to Genesis, with darkness. What's the second to last plague? Darkness. It's going in reverse, God says. Your disobedience of me, I'm the natural judge. I've made you to be a certain way. I fashioned you. And I give you my law. I give you myself, not as rules to follow, but as a relationship to live in, he says. And when you choose anything else but me, you deteriorate. Life deteriorates. Let me give an example. I'll give two illustrations for you here to try to drive home what I mean here. That he's the natural judge. And disobedience to God is not simply just breaking his rules. He says, don't obey me just because they're rules. I'm not a tyrannical despot. Follow me because it's a relationship. I've made you a certain way. And when you put anything else above me, God says, it'll ruin you, it'll disintegrate you, it'll deteriorate you, just like this is deteriorating. Each plague, one on top of another. Here's the example. You go to the doctor. Doctor gives the annual checkup. The doctor says to you, you have amazingly high cholesterol, the bad type, and you have amazingly high blood pressure. So I'm going to give you some medicine, and he gives you a list of things that you're not supposed to eat. Don't eat red meat, too much red meat. Don't drink this, don't eat that. He gives you these rules. Now, would you turn to your doctor and say, listen, sir, I believe you are a mean and oppressive ruler who simply wants to direct my life and govern me inappropriately. I choose not to follow your rules. No, because the doctor would surely look at you and say, I don't care. This is for you. This is for your health. The doctor's, he's not a tyrant. He's just trying to help you. And he's saying, listen, if you don't follow this, if you don't listen to me, you will deteriorate. Your heart will fail. Your body will break down. Why? This is what God is saying to us through these plagues. Disobedience to him is not just a sin. It's a breaking of the natural order. It's a falling apart of the earth and the way you were wired. And you think about this and play it out in your life. Let's be real practical. Put your job in more importance to God. Overwork yourself. What happens? You begin to physically break down. You begin to emotionally break down, maybe psychologically. Put your family as more important than God. Choose not to obey him, but obey whatever's best for your family more than him. You will break down. You'll be controlling. You'll be manipulative. You'll break down. See, God says, if you want to know me, who is the Lord that I should heed him? He's the Lord of nature, of the natural harmony of things. He says, he looks at you and me, and he says, I fashioned you a certain way. I made you to be a certain way. And when you don't follow that, when you put anything in the place of me, it'll rule you. And you will deteriorate. You'll fall apart. Because I'm your maker, not just your boss. Let me give a silly example. Pinocchio. Can we talk about Pinocchio, the book, not the movie? The movie sugarcoats it. The Misadventures of Pinocchio. You ever read this story? Anybody? You know what happens to Pinocchio? Pinocchio's a little mischievous, right? But Geppetto, the wood carver, he gets the piece of talking wood that somebody donates to him. And all he wants is a boy. That's all he wants. So he begins to carve and fashion out of the wood the very image of the thing that he wants, the boy that he's always wanted. And in the book, if you remember, right when he starts to carve Pinocchio's foot out, Pinocchio kicks him. And he kicks him again. And he kicks him again. Geppetto continues, and as he finishes the feet, the very moment that he finishes carving the feet, Pinocchio runs away. And Geppetto, of course, goes and looks for him, and the police in the story see Pinocchio, and they think Geppetto did something wrong, so Geppetto's got to go to jail. While Geppetto's in jail, Pinocchio falls asleep by the stove, and his feet, precious feet, burn off. Geppetto comes back, and Geppetto says, I'll make you new feet. And he fashions him new feet, and for one moment, one brief moment, Pinocchio is so overwhelmed with gratitude, he says, I will go to school for you, Geppetto, which was Geppetto's dream. Geppetto sells his only coat, gives Pinocchio the money, and if you read the rest of the story, there's a reason why it's called The Misadventures of Pinocchio, because he constantly screws up. He's always running away from his maker, from the way he was meant to be. And do you know what happens to him? His nose grows every time he disobeys. He's being distorted. He's being brought out of the shape in which he was made. And there's a great line from Geppetto when he's talking to the blue fairy, and Geppetto looks at it and says, I've warned him not to wander off here and there. He can be such a naughty boy. Even so, he's very precious to me. And the blue fairy says, why? And he says, well, because I made him. He's no puppet. Pinocchio is my little boy. See, throughout the story, Pinocchio rails against his nature, rails against his maker. And as he does so, he becomes distorted. He becomes a distorted, disintegrated figure of who he was meant to be. And God says, listen, this is what's happening in the plagues. Nature's deteriorating through disobedience. And when you and I disobey, we're deteriorating. Who is the Lord that I should heed him? He's your maker. He's fashioned you. He's made you. This is why God says, I need to be the total of your life. I need to be the everything. Put anything above me, your job, the opinions of others, your sense of independence, your relationships, your marriage, even your own family, put them above me, and you will slowly deteriorate. You will become a distorted, Pinocchio-esque figure of who you were meant to be if you forever kick against me, he says. Now, I could stop there, and I should, because I think some of you might be hungry. And if I did stop there, I'd be doing you a major disservice. You know why? Because I just told you, I spent about 10 minutes telling you to obey God, because if you don't, you will be disintegrated, you will deteriorate, you'll fall apart. And you say, that's horrible sounding. Okay, I'll follow him, whatever you want. I don't want to get a big nose like Pinocchio. I don't want to fall apart. Fine, that's fine. But you know what that is? That's fear. And fear will get you to about halfway through lunch today. If you ask the question, who is the Lord that I should heed him? And you say, okay, Pastor, now I want to obey. Now I understand that when I don't obey, things fall apart. That's fear motivating you. But there's something even more beautiful that he does through these plagues. He's not just the natural Lord, he's the saving Lord. Or another way you can put it is this: he's the Lord who relents. You need to see, the plagues are judgment, yes. But they're the most interesting form of judgment. Again, going back to Pharaoh, if God wanted to say, Pharaoh, do you want to know who I am? Here's the magic act. I'll take your palace and I'll move it, 100 kilometers over here. Now surely believe me. He could have done any sort of magical, wonderful, fantastical acts. But you notice that what he does here? It almost looks like it's weak. Because throughout the plagues, he continually relents. Each plague that comes, he pulls it back. The way you can think about it is this. It's like okay, let's go boxing match, okay? All the illustration I have. I've never boxed. I'd last probably 6 seconds in the ring before I pass out. That's okay. But work with me. You're in a boxing match, and God's boxing with Pharaoh, and he's giving it to him, right? He's giving it to him. Body blow, uppercut. Okay, he's giving. I'm not going to fake it because I don't even know what I'm doing up here. I'm just moving my hands aimlessly. He's boxing with him. He's punching him. He's giving plague after plague after plague. Then the plague of the hail comes. And God goes to Pharaoh in chapter 9, and he warns him. And God says, Pharaoh, I could have gotten rid of you already, but I haven't. Imagine this. God has got Pharaoh on the ropes. He's punching. It's head, body blow. Now for the knockout punch. And he pulls it. He doesn't get it. He relents. Each plague is pulled back. Even the darkness, after 3 days, is pulled back. Why 3? Why not 23? Why not 33? Why not 103 days of darkness? Surely that would have convinced them, would it not? God puts 103 days of complete abject darkness, and he says it's darkness that can be felt, by the way. I'll get to that in a second. Why not 433 days of darkness? Why just 3? Because it's God's way of saying, listen, yes, there's judgment. There's evil in the world, and something needs to be fixed about it. And I'll fix it. I judge it. But know this, I save you through it. Do you see? This is not a big, bad God. This is not a God who's like a child with a magnifying glass and the sunshine burning little ants on an anthill. He's a merciful God. He's a saving God. Why? Because he says there is sin in the world. Things are broken in the world. There is disobedience, and I have to fix it. I have to judge it. But I relent. Ultimately, the darkness, the second to last plague, only lasts 3 days. But the Israelites says they got light. Grace. Salvation through the judgment. And you say, Pastor, what does that even mean? Salvation through judgment? I don't even buy that. This God is judging. He's mean. He's throwing plague after plague down. And darkness comes as the second to last one. And it comes over the land. And it's a darkness that's felt, meaning it's a darkness that's painful. There's another time that darkness comes down. This time it doesn't come for 3 days. It comes for 3 hours. And when it comes down for 3 hours, it means the death of a person. And to this person, they'll go to hell for 3 days in abject darkness. Talk about darkness that can be felt. It's Jesus. See, the plagues only point to something greater than them. God says, I will give you plagues, yes, to judge. Darkness is the ultimate judgment, but know this, the darkness of ultimate judgment came down on Jesus on the cross for those 3 hours. And he went to hell for the 3 days in abject, painful darkness for you. Do you see now? When you feel like the plagues of the world are coming down on you, look at this plague of darkness. And instead of seeing a tyrannical God who only wants judgment, see that he's a gracious God who gives salvation through the judgment. People needed to be saved, but it was only through the judgment of the darkness. But the ultimate darkness, people, it falls on him, on the cross. The Gospels say that for 3 hours the land was dark as Jesus hung and died. 3. Darkness comes. It's judgment. But you see now, this is a God, when you say, who is the Lord that I should heed him? Here's your answer. He's the Lord who fashioned you and made you to be what you are. Break from him and you'll become a distorted figure of yourself. Worship anything else more than him and you'll break apart. But ultimately he says, don't do it out of fear. Do it because you see me relenting. The judgment comes down, but it came down on him, not on you and me. He got darkness, we get light. He got hell, we get heaven. He put the darkness down on him so that we don't get the darkness. Now, what does this mean? If you know that the darkness of the whole entire world, the darkness of your sin, the darkness of your past, the mistakes you've made, if you know all of that was given to him, doesn't that free you? If you know that judgment came down, but ultimately salvation came through the judgment, doesn't that make you look around in your life and say, I don't have to be the judge of everybody else. I don't have to judge them. I don't have to rain plagues down on them. I don't have to put darkness down on them. Why? Because I was spared the darkness. I was spared the pain and the judgment that I deserved. How dare I do that to them? It makes you a more gracious person. It makes you a more forgiving person. Why? Because the gospel's gotten in. The plagues come, but he took them. He was the living water that was turned into blood for you. He had darkness put on him for you. See now the plagues say, who is the Lord that I should obey him? He's your maker. He's your savior. That's why. Go to him in prayer now. Take a moment in silence and reflect on this truth.